They never told you this story. They buried it beneath desert silence, beneath collapsed cabins and scrub oak, beneath the kind of snow that covers more than tracks. It covers sins. But once you hear it, you'll never look at power, faith, or loyalty the same way again, because in the winter of 1859, 7 women vanished from Cedar Valley, Utah, and the official record says they left to visit family in California. But the truth, they had no family in California, no wagons, no escorts, no trail in the snow, just silence. 7 wives erased so thoroughly you weren't supposed to even imagine them, yet here you are about to know their names, their secrets, their fate, and once you know, you can't unknow. So let me ask you before we begin, where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments, because after tonight, your name, your location, your very presence in this circle, it will mark you as someone who chose to look into the shadows where others keep their eyes closed. Now listen. What you're about to hear isn't a campfire tale, it's not folklore, it's not even a clean entry in a dusty history book. This is something else entirely. This is the kind of story that moves in whispers, in private journals, in the brittle paper of letters never meant to see daylight, the kind of story that reminds you, history is not just what happened, it's what was allowed to survive, and in 1859, Utah, survival meant silence. Cedar Valley wasn't just a town, it was a fortress without walls, a scar carved into the land 30 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. 300 souls survived there, barely, scraping life out of alkali soil and the bone-dry desert air. But beneath the prayers, beneath the hymns, beneath the endless sermons about unity, the valley hid another life, a hidden covenant, wives who did not exist on paper, marriages sealed in secrecy, births recorded only eyes, and family Bibles locked away from census takers. Women invisible to the law, invisible to Washington, invisible even to their own nation. But invisibility cuts both ways. When the time came, it meant they could be erased without consequence. And that time came faster than anyone expected. The winter of 1858 to 59 was brutal. Snow early, ice thicker than memory, weeks without sun, families huddled in cabins where smoke seeped through cracked roofs and children slept 3 to a bed just to survive the cold. Isolation was normally a shield, but that winter, isolation became a coffin. Cedar Valley wasn't alone anymore. Just 40 miles away at Camp Floyd, 2,000 federal troops waited, restless, suspicious, under orders to keep an eye on the Mormons who, only a year before, had stood on the brink of open rebellion. And here's the part you were never supposed to hear. Those 7 wives. They weren't just wives. They weren't just unseen appendages in someone else's household. They were listening, watching, recording. They became shadows that could hear everything, remember everything, and, if they chose, give it all away. And some of them did. To the wrong men, to federal agents who came disguised as traders, as cattle buyers, as travelers just passing through. Men who paid in cash, who promised protection, who whispered offers of escape. That was the spark. 7 women caught between loyalty to husbands who never counted them as real and the chance at freedom dangled by strangers. And when that spark caught fire, it forced a choice on the men of Cedar Valley, a choice so brutal, so absolute that even now most historians refuse to name it. But I'll name it. And as I do, you'll feel something stirring inside you. Because once you glimpse how power defends itself, you start to recognize the same patterns everywhere. Religion, politics, corporations, even families. Conti, role is always built on silence, and when silence breaks, blood follows. So let's break it. The truth of Cedar Valley doesn't begin with the disappearances. The night they first gathered, the air inside Harper's General Store was colder than outside. Wind whistled through the seams of the log walls, candles flickered against cracked glass, and 7 men leaned over a scarred oak table with the kind of tension that makes every breath feel heavier than it should. Elder Nathaniel Carrington presided, his face lined not just by years of desert sun, but by secrets carved deeper than time itself. These weren't farmers debating crop yields. These were guardians of something hidden, an arsenal buried 2 miles outside town, a reserve of rifles and ammunition that could turn Cedar Valley into a fortress overnight. But someone had been asking questions, too many questions, questions that no outsider should have known to ask. And that was the problem. The questions hadn't come from outsiders. They had come from inside their own households, from women. The men spoke in hushed tones, suspicion poisoning every word. Crawford admitted his wife Elizabeth had been unusually curious about his letters from Salt Lake. Harper recalled Mary Lou jotting down notes that seemed like nothing until he noticed they aligned with dates of supply shipments. Wallace confessed Miriam had shown an interest in his militia rotations. On their own, these details were harmless, but strung together, the pattern was undeniable. "It's the wives," Carrington finally whispered, and the words dropped like a blade into the room. Now understand what that meant. In Cedar Valley, wives weren't just wives. They were a shadow class, bound by a covenant that demanded obedience yet denied recognition. They could not testify in court, could not claim legal marriage, could not prove their children legitimate. They lived as ghosts, useful when invisibility protected the community, dangerous when invisibility made betrayal possible. The men had treated that invisibility as a ressource more. They never imagined it could become a weapon. But here's the darker truth. Suspicion alone wasn't enough. What turned whispers into conviction was evidence, and evidence came swiftly. One morning, Carrington found a letter, not addressed, not sealed, written in his fourth wife Sarah's careful, educated hand. It described the hidden caches in shocking detail, the number of rifles, the blind spots in defense lines, the timing of supply deliveries, information only he and the council should have known. Sarah, curious, intelligent Sarah, had become something more than a wife in the shadows. She was now the link between their hidden world and the eyes of the federal government. Do you see the shape of it yet? These women weren't careless gossips. They were deliberate. They had built their own network, comparing notes in kitchens, whispering during their own meetings, recording what their husbands thought safely concealed. Invisible on paper, yet omnipresent in life. And someone, federal agents from Camp Floyd, had seen their potential. Had offered them what the men never could, recognition, protection, perhaps even escape from a covenant that held them as property. But in exchange, they had to sell something. And they sold secrets. When Joshua Wallace uncovered rolled banknotes hidden among the stock of rifles, $67 marked with California banks, more wealth than most households saw in a year, everything snapped into focus. This wasn't curiosity. This was payment, treason bought with cash. Imagine what that did to the men in that dim back room. Their wives, sacred companions sealed under the authority of heaven, now stood revealed as liabilities, informants, traitors. Each man's household was compromised. Each bed he shared now carried the weight of betrayal. The covenant that had bound them together, that had defined their power, was suddenly a noose tightening around team ear necks. Do you feel the shift? Because this is the moment when faith turns to fear, and fear, when cornered, does not hesitate. The men of Cedar Valley had built their lives on secrecy, and when secrecy cracked, there was only one response they could imagine: elimination. Not justice, not exile, not confession before the congregation. No, those options left trails, left witnesses, left questions. They needed silence, final silence. And in that silence, 7 wives disappeared. But before the erasure came the decision. Before the decision came the debate. And before the debate came the realization that these women were not weak at all. They were powerful in ways the men had never admitted, because information, more than guns, more than grain, more than scripture, was the one weapon that could undo everything. And that is the secret they tried to bury, that women invisible on paper could see more clearly than men in power. That the covenant designed to control them became the very trap that destroyed them. So here's where the descent deepens. Ask yourself, how far would men go to preserve the illusion of control? How far would a community go to silence the very people who knew too much? In Cedar Valley, the answer was written in blood, and you're about to hear how the covenant became a death sentence. Picture this: March 18th, 1859, the coldest pre-dawn hours in Cedar Valley. 7 men gathered not in a church, not in a council hall, but 20 feet underground. In the dirt-stained root cellar beneath Samuel Brennan's homestead, a lantern swung overhead, casting crooked shadows against walls lined with potatoes and salted meat. The air smelled of iron and earth, damp and suffocating, and in that chamber the covenant faced itself in the mirror. They weren't talking about crops anymore. They weren't debating irrigation canals or new barns. They were weighing the cost of silence versus the cost of survival. And survival was winning. Carrington opened with the letter, Sarah's letter. He placed it on the rough-hewn table like a sacred text of betrayal. Each man leaned forward, reading the evidence of his own doom. Guard rotations, supply caches, strategic weaknesses, written in neat, feminine script, proof that the wives had not only seen what they should never have seen, but had written it down, preserved it, weaponized it. The silence was thick. Bishop Whitman broke it first. If federal agents have this, it's over. Not just for Cedar Valley. For every settlement south of here. They'll use it as pretext. Declare martial law, seize the weapons, scatter our families. His beard, frosted white from the cold, trembled as he spoke. Then came Crawford. We can't just let them vanish. If the wives disappear, agents will notice. They'll push harder. Push harder? Wallace spat, his voice sharp as a rifle crack. They've already pushed. Look around. They've been walking our trails at night, leaving tracks by our granaries. They know too much already, and if those women speak again, if they send another letter, they could bring the army on us before the thaw. The word hung there. Army. 2,000 men, armed, uniformed, disciplined. Camp Floyd's garrison was only a day's march away. Against them, Cedar Valley was nothing more than a cluster of cabins and frightened families. The men shifted, glanced at each other. No one wanted to say it, but the cellar seemed to demand it. Carrington finally gave voice to the thought they all circled around. We silence them here, or we lose everything. The lantern hissed. The men stared at him. He was suggesting the unthinkable, erasing their own wives. Harper shook his head first. That's murder. We are men of God. Men of God, Whitman hissed. Or men of survival, which matters more when soldiers ride through the canyon, when Washington declares us rebels again. Do you think Scripture will save your children when the rifles fire? The cellar grew heavier with every word. Their faith, their marriages, their very covenant, all pressed against the stone fact that their wives had chosen another allegiance, an allegiance bought with money, but stronger than vows. Singleton broke next. He spoke with a voice drained of emotion. They're not wives anymore. They're agents. If we see them that way, the path is clear. And that was the crack. Once one man said it, the others followed. Treason, espionage, betrayal. The words rolled through the chamber until the women they loved were no longer women. They were threats, and threats must be neutralized. This is how power works. It convinces itself. It finds language that softens the cruelty. It renames murder as necessity. It renames wives as liabilities. It renames silence as survival. The men voted in whispers, but every whisper cut deeper than any blade. The decision was unanimous, not because they all wanted it, but because none of them could live with the alternative. The lantern flickered once, as though the air itself recoiled. The covenant had turned cannibal. To preserve itself, it would consume its own flesh, and in that root cellar, a new oath was born. Not a covenant of marriage, but a covenant of elimination. A pact sealed not by love, not by scripture, but by the promise that no one outside this circle would ever know what became of the 7 wives of Cedar Valley. But you know now, and what comes next will make you question just how far a man can go when faith and fear collide. Once the oath was spoken, the cellar went silent. Not a word, not a cough, only the faint scratching of the lantern flame, as if the fire itself had heard too much and wanted out. The 7 men knew there was no turning back, and so the next step was not prayer, not confession, it was logistics. If murder is to be carried out in secret, it must be disguised as something ordinary. And in Cedar Valley, ordinary meant disappearance. Families drifted west to California all the time, chasing gold, chasing opportunity, chasing the promise of freedom from the federal chokehold. California was the perfect lie. Far enough away to be untraceable, convenient enough to be believable. Harper spoke first, his voice steady now, transformed by grim acceptance. The records will say they left to visit family in California. No one checks, no one asks. A wagon, a few supplies noted in the ledger, that's all it will take. Wallace countered, but there are no wagons, no family. Carrington leaned forward, his green eyes reflecting the lantern flame. Then we invent them. We are the record. Understand this. In this valley, truth is what we write down, and what we do not write down never existed. There it was, the doctrine of control, sharper than any scripture. Truth wasn't about reality. Truth was about record. Paper, ink, memory. These were the weapons more decisive than rifles. If the wives vanished in blood, it would be murder. But if the record said California, it would be destiny. So they began the planning. One by one, the names were spoken aloud like a death litany. Sarah Peaton, Rebecca Dalton, Catherine Fletcher, Mary Lou Kensington, Elizabeth Fairchild, Anna Sullivan, Miriam Wallace. Each husband was tasked with managing his own wife's departure, supplies staged, neighbors informed casually of travel plans, ledger entries prepared in advance, and because Cedar Valley kept no official territorial register of plural marriages, the women's legal invisibility became their final shroud. No lawman would ever come searching for women who did not exist on paper. But here's the part that reveals the darker machinery at work. They rehearsed the story. Like actors on a stage, these men practiced how they would speak to neighbors, to travelers, even to children. They crafted sentences as if words could erase flesh. She's gone to visit kin in California. She took the wagon road with her sister's family. She felt called to seek opportunity out west. Phrases polished into routine, lies sharpened into weapons. Whitman insisted they synchronize the timeline. If they vanish one by one, it will draw attention. We stagger them, yes, but close enough to create confusion. 3 weeks at most. By spring thaw, they will all be gone. It was Singleton who introduced the coldest calculation of all. We must not only hide their absence, we must bury their presence, burn letters, tear out pages from family Bibles, destroy keepsakes, leave nothing that might provoke remembrance. No objects, no papers, no echoes. Think about that. Not content with erasing lives, they sought to erase memory itself, to make their wives not just dead but unremembered, a kind of second death, more suffocating than the first. And yet, beneath all this steel-plated pragmatism, guilt still gnawed. Harper hesitated. Brennan trembled. Even Carrington's voice faltered when Margaret's name surfaced, for Margaret had vouched for Sarah, had been her quiet ally. To kill Sarah meant betraying Margaret too. The weight pressed down on every man, but instead of shattering them, it drove them deeper into silence. This is the twisted genius of control systems. They turn conscience into the enemy. They convince you that mercy is betrayal, and betrayal is survival. These men didn't stop believing in God that night. They simply convinced themselves that God demanded blood to preserve his people, and so the covenant of marriage became the covenant of disappearance. It began, as it always does, with someone trusted. Betrayal never comes from strangers. It comes from the familiar hand, the known voice, the face you once thought was sanctuary. For Sarah Peaton, that hand belonged to the man she called husband, the man who had once convinced her that crossing 1,000 miles of wilderness to join his household was divine destiny. Elder Nathaniel Carrington. On the night of March 21st, 1859, the snow outside lay heavy, thick enough to swallow footsteps. Carrington asked Sarah to walk with him. No one questioned a husband speaking privately to a wife. Margaret, his first wife, watched from the cabin doorway as Sarah, shawl drawn tight, followed him into the brittle dark. She thought little of it. She had no idea it was the last time she would see Sarah alive. The walk led south toward the granary, then veered sharply off the path into the cottonwoods that lined the creek. The air was so cold it burned with each breath. Sarah tried to ask why they walked this far, but Carrington hushed her. His voice was steady, paternal almost. We must speak of matters that cannot be overheard. And here lies the cruelty. Sarah trusted him. Despite suspicion, despite the chill in his eyes, she believed this was simply another test of faith, another moment when she might prove loyalty, devotion, obedience. That trust carried her deeper into the trees, where another shadow waited, Joshua Wallace, rifle slung across his back, jaw set like stone. Sarah slowed. Her instincts stirred. "Why is Brother Wallace here?" she asked, the question trembling in the night air. Carrington stopped walking, his breath clouded before him. "Because we know, Sarah. We know what you've written. We know what you've passed." Silence. Then the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Sarah's hands tightened around her shawl. "I did it to protect us," she said. Protect the children, to secure our families if the soldiers came. I thought," but Carrington cut her off. "You thought you could barter with wolves. You thought survival meant betrayal. No, Sarah, you've endangered us all." Here's the psychological knife. Carrington did not rage, did not curse. He spoke like a prophet delivering revelation, calm, absolute. That calmness told Sarah her fate was sealed. Anger could be persuaded, bargained with, softened, but calmness meant judgment. She dropped to her knees in the snow, not pleading, praying. Words rushed from her lips in broken fragments, fragments of scripture, fragments of apology, fragments of desperation. But her words only hung in the frozen air, unanswered. Wallace stepped forward, rope in hand. History does not preserve the exact moment when rope met flesh. Some say she was strangled, some say the creek took her, others whisper her body was hidden beneath the floorboards of a collapsed cabin, buried with a journal that later surfaced decades later. But this much is certain. By dawn, Sarah Peaton was gone. And when Carrington returned to the cabin alone, Margaret asked nothing. She simply looked into his eyes and knew silence was safer than questions. This was the first disappearance, the test case, and it worked. No alarm, no federal patrols arriving at the valley gates, no neighbors demanding answers. By the next Sunday, the record books bore a neat, false entry. Sarah Peaton departed for California, March 1859. Ink against paper, fiction against flesh. The covenant of erasure had begun. Understand this. When the first silence succeeds, the rest becomes inevitable. Each man now knew it could be done, that he could walk back into his home, sit by the fire, eat bread with his children, and say nothing of the body cooling in the dark outside. Survival had been proven stronger than conscience, and once conscience rarely returns. Sarah's death was not just an ending, it was the blueprint, a ritual of elimination cloaked in piety, executed with calm conviction. The others would follow one by one, until Cedar Valley's invisible wives were invisible in truth. And this is the descent you now walk with me. Each disappearance, not as accident, not as tragedy, but as deliberate design. If Sarah Peaton's erasure was cold, clinical, almost surgical in its execution, Rebecca Dalton's was fire and noise, a struggle that refused to be swallowed in silence. And that resistance would haunt the men of Cedar Valley, reminding them that you cannot erase a human being without leaving scars, even if the scars are hidden. Rebecca was Samuel Brennan's third wife, 26 years old, sharp-witted, restless, the kind of woman who never quite bent to the mold expected of her. Samuel had married her under the shadow of convenience. Her dowry of grain and tools strengthened his household, but her presence always felt volatile, combustible, and unlike Sarah, Rebecca didn't write her intelligence down in neat, careful script. She carried it in memory, storing details of wagon deliveries, militia drills, and food reserves. If Sarah was the clerk of this hidden network, Rebecca was its courier. On March 26th, just 5 nights after Sarah vanished, the council decided it was time. They could not risk her slipping away to meet an agent again. Brennan, unlike Carrington, lacked the cold steel of leadership. He trembled, hesitated, second-guessed. He loved Rebecca in his own conflicted way, though love here meant something twisted, an ownership complicated by resentment. Still, when the council pressed him, he relented. His weakness became the entry point for collective pressure. That evening, Rebecca was told she must help with supplies at the granary, a simple request, nothing suspicious. She wrapped her shawl and followed Samuel, her steps brisk against the frosted earth. But when she entered the granary, the flicker of lamplight revealed not just Samuel, but two other figures, Harper and Crawford, waiting in the shadows. Her breath caught. "What is this?" No one answered. Samuel closed the door. The sound of the latch echoed like a verdict. She turned on him, her vow, ice sharper than steel. "You know, don't you? You've read it in my eyes. You've heard it in whispers. You think I betrayed you." Her defiance rattled him. She stepped closer, jabbing her finger into his chest. "And maybe I did. Maybe I gave them the truth you men were too proud to see. Maybe I told them where you hide your rifles, your powder, your little illusions of power. Because I am tired of being invisible. I am tired of living as nothing. If they promised me freedom, why shouldn't I take it?" Brennan's face broke. Not anger, anguish. But Harper was not as fragile. He stepped forward, rope ready. Rebecca fought. Unlike Sarah, she did not kneel, did not pray. She screamed. She clawed. Her nails raked Brennan's cheek, drawing blood. She kicked the lantern, shattering glass, plunging the granary into half-darkness. The fire nearly caught on spilled grain before Crawford stomped it out. The scene was chaos, exactly what they feared. When it was over, Rebecca lay crumpled against the wooden wall, her hair tangled, her breath silenced by hands too strong for her defiance. The men stood in the stillness, panting, hearts pounding like war drums. This was no clean disappearance. Neighbors had heard something. Shouts, the crash of glass. Samuel's cheek bore scratches impossible to hide. The story had to be rewritten quickly. They spread the tale that Rebecca had quarreled with Samuel, that she had stormed off in anger, vowing to leave for California without delay. Her absence became framed not as a quiet departure, but as a rebellious escape. And here's the darker truth. Some neighbors believed it, because belief is not about evidence, it's about convenience. People will believe anything that keeps their world intact. But among the council, cracks were forming. Brennan shook for days, unable to sleep, tormented by the memory of her voice screaming in the dark. "Harper me." Or hardened, reminded him again and again. She was already gone the moment she chose the agents. We only closed the gap. Still, guilt is a stubborn ghost, and Brennan's weakness would return later, threatening the entire cover. Rebecca's death was proof that silence could not always be neat, and with every wife removed, the men carried more weight, more lies, more blood. The covenant was unraveling, thread by thread, and yet they pressed forward. Next in line, Catherine Fletcher, 19 years old, barely more than a girl, and her erasure would reveal just how far they were willing to descend. If Sarah Patton's silence was calculation and Rebecca Dalton's was chaos, Catherine Fletcher's was tragedy. She was only 19, barely old enough to be called a wife, yet already bound in a covenant that stripped her of girlhood before she could name it. Catherine had been married into Elder Wittmann's household at 16, a child cloaked in the title of sister wife. Her father had bartered her as proof of loyalty, a gesture to keep his family within the graces of Cedar Valley's leadership. She was pale, slender, and shy, yet her quietness hid a resilience. She listened more than she spoke, and in those silences she absorbed everything. Arguments between the elders, coded conversations about supplies, even the uneasy glances exchanged after Sarah and Rebecca vanished. By April, Catherine knew something was wrong. 2 women, gone. Whispers of California that never rang true. Empty beds at night. The valley felt haunted, as though silence itself had grown fangs. She began to ask questions, not loudly, not confrontationally, but to her closest friend, Anna Sullivan, another young wife barely older than herself. "Do you believe them?" she whispered one night. "Do you believe Sarah and Rebecca left, that they will send word from California?" Anna's eyes darted toward the door before she answered. "We must not doubt aloud." But Catherine could not bury her doubts, and that made her dangerous. Wittmann sensed it first. He saw it in her glances, the way her eyes lingered when the councilmen exchanged words. She was a vessel filling too quickly, a cup about to spill, and so her name entered the circle. Her erasure was planned for the second week of April under the guise of spring gathering. Unlike Sarah, she was not summoned to walk under stars. Unlike Rebecca, she was not cornered in a granary. Catherine's end came during daylight, cloaked in routine. On April 9th, the Wittmann asked her to help drive sheep to the southern meadow. It was a task young wives often did, nothing unusual. She agreed, glad for the excuse to breathe air away from the valley's oppressive cabins. The flock moved slowly, bells clinking, hooves stirring dust. She carried a stick, urging stragglers forward, her shawl slipping from her shoulders in the spring sun. At the meadow's edge, away from sight, Harper and Crawford waited again. Catherine laughed at first, thinking it a surprise, a shared task, but the moment she saw their faces, hollow, grim, unblinking, her laughter froze. "Why are they here?" she asked. Wittmann didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. Catherine's breath grew ragged. She dropped the stick. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have done nothing. I have spoken no word. If you fear me, I will swear again. I will swear in blood if I must. Please." It is here that the descent turned monstrous, because, unlike Sarah and Rebecca, Catherine's crime was not betrayal, not resistance. It was merely knowledge. She was too young, too vulnerable, too observant, and that was enough to condemn her. She ran. For a brief, wild moment, she bolted across the meadow, hair streaming, heart pounding. But she was caught quickly, her body small, her strength no match for men hardened by frontier life. She screamed. The sheep scattered. The act itself was clumsy, brutal. No careful rope this time, no muffled struggle in darkness, just raw violence beneath the open sky. By the time her body fell still, the meadow was littered with frightened sheep and the silence of men who had crossed a new threshold. When Wittmann returned alone, he crafted the story with chilling precision. "Catherine grew restless," he told the household. "She left us for California, as others have. The sheep were driven without her." But not everyone believed it. And Sullivan's eyes brimmed with questions she dared not voice. Margaret Carrington felt the lie scrape against her ribs. The women sensed a pattern, even if the men erased the record. Catherine's elimination marked a turn. This was no longer about survival. This was control, unchained, power-devouring innocence. If Sarah's death had been justification and Rebecca's had been necessity, Catherine's was revelation. They would kill not only traitors, not only rebels, but anyone who threatened the illusion of obedience, even a girl of 19. The covenant had mutated into something darker than survival. It was now a hunger, one that would not stop until every shadow of doubt was extinguished. Next would come Mary Lou Kensington, and with her the covenant would stumble into blood that refused to stay hidden. Mary Lou Kensington was no child, no naive bride quietly folded into the household order. She was 33, seasoned, sharp-tongued, and unafraid of conflict. A midwife by practice, she had delivered more children in Cedar Valley than anyone else, and that gave her authority among the women. If Catherine Fletcher was innocence lost, Mary Lou was defiance embodied. She had married into Thomas Kensington's household in her late 20s, after her first husband died on the trail west. Unlike most of the wives in Cedar Valley, Mary Lou had once known a different life, freer, less bound by covenant law. She had lived among miners, traders, and emigrants. She had seen cities and read newspapers. She carried with her the memory of a wider world, and she never let anyone forget it. By the time Sarah, Rebecca, and Catherine had vanished, Mary Lou was already suspicious. She asked questions out loud, in ways the others were too fearful to attempt. At births, when women gathered close, she whispered warnings. "Don't believe what they tell you. They are hiding something. 3 wives gone, and no word from California. That is no accident." Her voice spread like wildfire. The women listened, and though they dared not speak openly, a seed of rebellion grew in them. That alone made her dangerous. The council debated for weeks. Some argued she must be silenced before her influence spread further. Others hesitated. Mary Lou was too visible, too important to the households. Killing her risked suspicion from beyond the valley, but influence is as threatening as betrayal, and by late April the council's patience was gone. The plan was crafted with precision. Mary Lou would vanish on the night of April 28th. Kensington himself would lead her out, under the pretense of visiting a sick child in the southern settlement. She would never arrive. But Mary Lou was not naive. She had watched Catherine disappear, had traced the silence around Sarah and Rebecca. She sensed the noose tightening. That evening, when Kensington asked her to ride with him, she studied his face carefully. His eyes darted, his hands fidgeted. He was a poor liar. Still, she agreed. To refuse would have sealed her fate just as surely. But as she mounted the wagon beside him, she tucked a small knife beneath her skirts, hidden against her thigh. They rode under the pale moonlight, the wheels creaking, the horse's breath steaming in the chill. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Mary Lou broke the silence. "I know," she said. Kensington stiffened. "I know what happened to Sarah, to Rebecca, to that poor child, Catherine, and I know this ride won't end where you claim." Her words cut through the night like a blade. Kensington swallowed hard, his knuckles white against the reins. "You speak of things you don't understand," he muttered. But Mary Lou pressed on. "I understand enough, and I swear to you, Thomas, if you lay a hand on me, every woman in this valley will know. I've told them. I've told Anna Sullivan. I've told Margaret Carrington. If I vanish, they'll know you did it. They'll whisper it until the walls collapse." Kensington's face twisted, torn between fear and duty. He was not Carrington, cold and resolute. He was not Harper, hardened by brutality. He was weak, trembling, a man cornered by the covenant he served. The struggle came suddenly. As the wagon rolled into the cottonwoods, Mary Lou reached for her knife. Kensington lunged, grappling with her in the seat. The horse reared, the wagon jolted, and the knife slashed across his arm, blood darkening his sleeve. She fought like a wild animal, clawing, striking, screaming into the trees. Harper and Crawford emerged from the shadows as always. They dragged her down from the wagon, silencing her cries, but she did not go quietly. Her voice echoed into the night, carrying through the valley. "Murderers! You are murderers!" Those were the last words the women of Cedar Valley ever heard from Mary Lou Kensington. Her body vanished, hidden in earth or water, as the others had been. But her words lingered. The next morning, whispers spread among the households. Anna Sullivan trembled with fear. Margaret Carrington's hands shook as she baked bread, and even the children sensed the unease. For the first time, suspicion was not confined to private thoughts. It seeped into the air, uncontainable. The men worked quickly to bury the truth. They claimed Mary Lou had taken her chance and fled, angry at her husband, desperate for freedom, but no one believed it fully. Too many had heard her scream, too many saw Kensington's bandaged arm, a wound he could not explain. The covenant cracked that night. It did not collapse yet, but the fracture was visible. For the first time, silence failed. And with silence failing, fear began to turn inward. The men no longer trusted one another. Each wondered who might falter next, who might confess, who might let slip the truth that blood had replaced obedience as the valley's covenant. Mary Lou's voice had been silenced, but her echo lived on, a whisper that would not die. The descent was accelerating, and the next disappearance, Eleanor Price, would drag Cedar Valley to the edge of open collapse. By the time Eleanor Price's name entered the council's whispers, Cedar Valley was already unraveling. Mary Lou Kensington's screams still haunted the cottonwoods, and her absence had bred a sickness of doubt among the women. Sarah Peaton had been erased neatly, Rebecca Dalton chaotically, Catherine Fletcher tragically, and Mary Lou defiantly. But Eleanor's disappearance would mark the moment when the covenant began to cannibalize itself. Eleanor was not like the others. At 41, she was one of the oldest wives in the valley, a widow remarried for utility rather than passion. She was practical, steady, with no illusions about love or covenantal romance. She kept gardens, tended to chickens, preserved food for winter. She was the kind of woman who never complained, but saw everything. And that was the problem. Eleanor was observant to the point of danger. She noticed the scratches on Brennan's face after Rebecca vanished. She saw Kensington's bandaged arm, and she watched Margaret Carrington flinch when her husband touched her shoulder. She put the fragments together with the precision of someone who had lived too long to accept simple lies. Unlike Mary Lou, Eleanor did not speak loudly. She whispered. She leaned close to women at the well, murmuring, "We are not widowed. We are surrounded by widowers who lie." Her words were quiet, but they spread like mold, slow and invasive. By early May, the council knew she had to go. Not because she had betrayed them to outsiders, there was no proof of that, but because she had become a mirror reflecting their guilt back at them, and mirrors are intolerable to men who live by secrecy. But here, something shifted. Unlike the others, Eleanor's fate divided the men. Carrington, always cold and decisive, argued she must vanish. Harper agreed, ruthless as ever. Yet Brennan hesitated, his conscience still bleeding from Rebecca's debate. Arthage. Kensington, rattled by Mary Lou's screams, nearly refused altogether. Whitman wavered, torn between fear of exposure and exhaustion from killing. The covenant was breaking from within. No longer united, the men eyed one another with suspicion. Who would falter? Who would confess? Who would turn? Still, Carrington prevailed. His voice, iron and commanding, cut through their doubts. One fracture becomes two, then four, then collapse. If Eleanor remains, she will shatter us. So the plan was laid. On May 12th, Eleanor was summoned to assist at a birthing. It was a false summons. No woman was in labor. The ruse brought her to the northern ridge, away from cabins, under the pretense of gathering herbs for the expectant mother. Harper led her there with Whitman trailing. Eleanor knew before they spoke. Her face hardened, her hands steady, even as Harper's rope dangled at his side. "So it is me now," she said. Neither man answered. "You think killing us will save you," she continued. "But it will not. Every death binds you tighter. Every lie eats your soul. You men are already ghosts. You just haven't seen your graves yet." Her words cut deep, striking the core of their fear. For the first time, Whitman faltered. He dropped his gaze, trembling. Harper moved forward, merciless, but the act was messy. Eleanor did not fight like Rebecca, or scream like Mary Lou. She simply stood firm, forcing them to drag her down. She did not resist. She did not plead. She looked at Whitman the entire time, her silence heavier than cries could ever be. When it was over, Whitman vomited into the dirt. Harper spat, muttering that weakness would doom them all. The cover story collapsed quickly. Eleanor's absence could not be explained away as wanderlust. She was too rooted, too steady, too essential to daily survival. Women murmured openly, Eleanor would never leave her gardens, and Eleanor would never abandon her flock. The men doubled down on their lies, but the valley no longer believed. Mary Lou's screams had cracked the covenant. Eleanor's quiet death shattered it further. And worse, the men themselves were turning. Brennan drank heavily, his grief spilling into rants. Kensington avoided meetings, his arm still scarred. Whitman's sleep was broken by Eleanor's steady gaze, her words echoing, "You are already ghosts." Only Carrington and Harper remained resolute, binding the others with threats more than faith. The covenant no longer united them. It held them hostage. Eleanor Price was gone, but her absence was not silence. It was a roar building beneath the surface, a tide that could not be stopped. The valley had reached its breaking point, and with the final disappearance, the girl Rachel Hemmings, barely 16, Cedar Valley would tip from secrecy into madness. Rachel Hemmings was the youngest of them all, 16, still soft with girlhood, still more child than wife. She had been brought into Cedar Valley the previous autumn, promised as a bride to Benjamin Harper through her father's arrangement. To Harper, she was proof of dominance, a living prize. To the other women, she was a daughter figure, protected, pitied, whispered about when she walked by with downcast eyes. By May, the valley was saturated with unease. Sarah, Rebecca, Catherine, Mary Lou, Eleanor, 5 wives gone. The stories of California no longer fooled anyone. The council's lies grew thinner with each disappearance. Rachel, wide-eyed and frightened, absorbed it all. She watched the women hush their voices when men approached. She watched Kensington flinch at shadows. She saw Whitman's hands shake at supper, and Carrington's eyes burn with something colder than faith. Her youth should have shielded her. But youth is fragile, and fragility is threatening to men who fear exposure. Rachel began to ask questions, small at first, innocent on their surface. When will Sarah write back? Why hasn't Rebecca sent for her children? Why would Eleanor leave her hens uncollected? Innocent questions, but questions nonetheless. And so her name entered the circle. The decision broke what little unity remained. Brennan refused outright. "She's a child," he hissed, slamming his fist against the council table. "God damn you all if you think I'll help bury her." Kensington remained silent, but his silence was cowardice, not agreement. Whitman wept openly, begging Carrington to reconsider. But Carrington's voice was iron. "Doubt grows in children fastest. If she whispers, if she tells the truth to her father, to her kin, the valley is finished. Do you think the outside world will spare us? No. Better one girl than all of us." Harper, cruel and unyielding, nodded in agreement. And the others bowed under the weight of fear. The plan was carried out on the night of May the 21st. Rachel was summoned under the pretense of gathering herbs for a sick calf. Harper led her, his hand heavy on her shoulder, guiding her into the cottonwood shadows where so many wives had already vanished. But Rachel sensed it. She trembled as she walked, her shawl clutched around her thin frame. "Please, Brother Harper," she whispered, "don't leave me out here. I'm afraid." The words pierced even Whitman, who had followed reluctantly. His steps faltered, his breathing ragged, but Harper pressed on, dragging her deeper into the dark. What followed was not careful, nor silent, nor even ritual. It was frenzy. Harper's cruelty boiled over, his hands rough, his voice a growl. Rachel screamed, the sound piercing the night, louder than Mary Lou, sharper than Rebecca. She fought, small but desperate, nails raking, feet kicking. Her screams carried far. Women heard them, men heard them, children stirred in their beds. It was no longer hidden. It was public, undeniable, the valley's secrets spilling into the night air. When it was done, Harper stood panting, his hands stained. Whitman collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Brennan turned and fled, unable to bear witness. Carrington alone remained steady, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. The next day, the valley was broken. No one believed the lies anymore. No one dared repeat them. The women clutched their children tighter, refusing to meet their husbands' eyes. Men avoided one another, silence turning from covenant to curse. Rachel's absence was not explained. It could not be. Everyone had heard her scream. Everyone had seen Harper return alone, his clothes rumpled, his face hard. The valley was no longer bound by obedience. It was bound by terror. And with terror came collapse. Families began to whisper of leaving, of fleeing into the mountains under cover of night. Trust dissolved, faith curdled. Rachel Hemmings was the last. After her, there were no more disappearances, because there was no covenant left to enforce them. The valley did not purge dissent, it devoured itself. Cedar Valley's silence, once a shield, had become a tomb. The disappearance of Mary Lou Henderson left Cedar Valley in a state of uneasy silence. 5 women were now gone, swallowed by the darkness of the covenant, and though no one dared to speak openly, the truth hung over every household like a storm cloud. Mothers clutched their children tighter at night, whispering lullabies that sounded more like desperate prayers. Men sat around wooden tables, their hands trembling as they raised cups of bitter coffee, their eyes darting to the door with every creak of the floorboards. The valley had changed. What was once a place of unity and faith had become a prison, suffocating those who lived within its bounds. Even the air felt heavier. The trees that surrounded the settlement seemed taller, darker, as if they leaned in closer each day to watch what was happening inside. Children were the first to sense it. They asked questions the adults refused to answer. Where is Miss Sarah? Why doesn't Mrs. Rebecca visit anymore? Why can't we see Aunt Catherine? Their voices were innocent, but their curiosity was dangerous. Mothers hushed them quickly, forcing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Fathers grew stern, demanding silence, yet in their hearts, everyone knew. The walls of secrecy were cracking. Whispers slithered through the valley like snakes. Some said the missing women had been cursed for disobeying God. Others muttered that they had been taken away in the dead of night by the very men who claimed to be their protectors. But no one had proof. No one dared to confront the council directly, except for the wives who remained. Each carried fear in her chest like a stone, waiting for the day it would be her turn. They saw the pattern clearly now. Anyone who resisted, anyone who questioned, was erased, and the knowledge of it was unbearable. At night, the valley became a different place altogether. Lanterns flickered inside houses, their yellow glow sharp against the darkness. Dogs barked at shadows. The sound of wind howling through the trees felt almost human, like the lost voices of the women calling back to the living. Many refused to walk outside after sundown. Even men, once proud and defiant, now hurried home before the last light faded. The covenant, however, did not falter. At each gathering, the leaders spoke with greater intensity. They promised salvation, insisted that order must be maintained, and warned against the sin of doubt. The more they preached, the more fragile their authority appeared, as though they were trying to convince themselves of the righteousness of their cause. Inside their homes, men began to drink more heavily. Some sat with their heads in their hands, whispering apologies no one would ever hear. Others grew crueler, lashing out at their wives and children to hide their own fear. The brotherhood that had once held them together was splintering, though none would admit it aloud. Cedar Valley was sinking into madness. Every knock at the door, every sudden shout in the distance, every scream of a bird in the night sent hearts racing. The settlement was no longer just haunted by what had been done. It was haunted by what was still to come. For deep inside every household, one question echoed louder than all others. Who will be next? As the days dragged on after Mary Lou's disappearance, the men of Cedar Valley carried a weight they could no longer hide. Their covenant had promised strength and unity, but instead it had birthed something monstrous. Behind closed doors, guilt gnawed at them like rats in the dark. Some husbands began to drink heavily, drowning their conscience in mugs of whiskey. Their eyes grew hollow, their voices slurred with apologies whispered to no one. Others masked their shame with anger, snapping at wives and children, desperate to bury their fear beneath cruelty. The brotherhood that once bound them was crumbling from the inside. They avoided each other's eyes during council meetings. The sermons of obedience no longer sounded like holy truth, but like desperate excuses. Each man feared exposure, not only of the covenant's secret, but of his own part in it. At night, their dreams betrayed them. They saw the faces of Sarah, Rebecca, Catherine, Eleanor, and Mary Lou. Sometimes the women screamed. Sometimes they stared silently, their eyes cold and accusing. The men woke drenched in sweat, their hearts pounding, their throats dry with shame. The guilt did not just haunt their minds, it seeped into their homes. Wives noticed the trembling hands, the sudden outbursts, the endless pacing. Children watched their fathers collapse into silence at the dinner table. The air was heavy with unspoken truths, and though no one dared to speak them, everyone could feel them. The covenant had demanded sacrifice, but now the men understood the cost. They had not only buried their wives, they had buried themselves. And with each passing night, the weight of their guilt made Cedar Valley feel less like a home and more like a grave. Rachel Hemmings was not like the other women of Cedar Valley. Barely 16, she was still more girl than woman, her laughter bright against the shadows that hung over the settlement. Her family had come to the valley only 2 years earlier, and while others learned quickly to bow their heads in silence, Rachel's eyes were filled with questions. She asked about the women who had vanished. She asked why their names were no longer spoken at the covenant gatherings, why the children of Sarah and Catherine cried quietly in the corners, why the men grew tense whenever their wives lingered too long together. Her curiosity, though innocent, was dangerous in a place where silence meant survival. Her mother begged her to stop. "Rachel," she whispered one night as they folded laundry by candlelight, "some questions are not meant to be asked." But Rachel would not be hushed. "If no one asks, how will we ever know the truth?" she replied. The council noticed her defiance. At first they dismissed it as childish chatter, but Rachel's words spread among the younger girls who began to echo her doubts. To the covenant, this was poison. rebellion sown at the roots. They whispered among themselves, warning that if left unchecked, Rachel's voice could undo everything they had built. One Sunday, during the gathering, she stood in the back of the chapel and asked a question that silenced the room. If God is with us, why does he take only the women? Gasps filled the air. Mothers pulled their daughters close, and the men on the council exchanged looks colder than steel. That night, Rachel's father was summoned. He returned home pale and trembling, refusing to look his daughter in the eyes. Rachel did not yet understand the weight of what she had done. She thought herself brave, even righteous, but the covenant had already marked her. In Cedar Valley, innocence was never a shield, it was a target. The night the council came for Rachel Hemmings, Cedar Valley felt more silent than usual. The crickets had hushed, the wind stood still, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. Rachel lay awake in her small bed, her heart pounding without knowing why. Then came the knock. Heavy. Final. Her father's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he opened the door. Lantern light spilled into the night, revealing 3 councilmen cloaked in black. Their faces were stern, their eyes glinting with the authority of men who believed themselves instruments of God. "Rachel must come with us," one said simply. Her father stammered, his voice breaking as he begged for mercy, but his pleas were drowned by the command in their voices. Rachel's mother clung to her daughter, sobbing into her hair, but rough hands pulled them apart. Rachel screamed, her nails clawing at the doorframe as they dragged her out into the darkness. Neighbors watched from their windows, their silhouettes trembling behind glass. They heard her cries, sharp and desperate, echoing through the valley streets. No one moved to help. No one dared. They brought her to the old barn at the edge of the settlement, the same place whispered about in fearful tones, where others had disappeared before her. Inside, the shadows swallowed her whole. Her voice, once so bold, now cracked with terror, as she begged for answers. "Why me? What have I done?" The council gave no reply. Their silence was heavier than words, a judgment written in the stillness. Then came the sounds, the struggle, the cries, the muffled sobs, and finally, nothing. By dawn, the barn stood empty, its doors swaying in the breeze. Rachel was gone. That morning, Cedar Valley woke to whispers that refused to be silenced. Unlike the women before her, Rachel had not gone quietly. Her screams had torn through the night, embedding themselves in the minds of every man, woman, and child who heard them. For the first time, the covenant's secret was no longer hidden in shadows. It had bled into the open, carried by the voice of a girl who refused to be silent. And though Rachel's body was never seen again, her terror lingered. A wound carved deep into the heart of Cedar Valley. Rachel's disappearance broke something in Cedar Valley that could never be repaired. The others had gone quietly, swallowed by secrecy and silence, but Rachel's screams had been heard by everyone. The sound of her terror clung to the valley like smoke after a fire. No sermon, no prayer, no stern command could erase it. The children whispered her name in trembling voices, even when their parents tried to hush them. Mothers sat awake through the night, staring at their daughters with a new fear, not of rebellion, but of losing them to the darkness that had already taken too many. Husbands avoided their wives' eyes, their guilt now burning hotter than ever. For the first time, whispers of escape spread through the settlement. A few women packed small bundles in secret, hiding food beneath floorboards and clothing in baskets. Some even dared to speak of slipping away under the cover of night, of leaving Cedar Valley behind forever. But the valley was surrounded by thick forests and mountains, and no one knew if freedom was truly possible, or if the covenant's reach extended farther than they imagined. The council reacted with fury. At the next gathering, their voices thundered from the pulpit. They called Rachel a traitor, a serpent sent to sow doubt. They warned that anyone who followed her path would meet the same fate, yet their words only deepened the fear. The louder they shouted, the clearer it became. They were no longer protecting the valley, they were protecting themselves. Even the weather seemed to turn against Cedar Valley. Storms gathered over the mountains, drenching the fields and flooding the paths. Lightning split the sky at night, and thunder rolled through the valley like the anger of heaven itself. To the frightened villagers, it felt like a curse, as if God himself had turned his face away. By the end of the week, Cedar Valley was no longer just a settlement bound by rules. It was a place of trembling shadows, of locked doors and sleepless nights. Trust had shattered. Fear had taken root in every heart. And for the first time, even the council began to wonder how long their grip would last. The covenant had always thrived on faith. Faith in God, faith in the council, faith that Cedar Valley was chosen, set apart from the corruption of the outside world. But after Rachel's screams, that faith began to fracture. At the Sunday gathering, the pews were filled, but the air was heavy with doubt. The council spoke with fire, their voices sharp and commanding. They demanded obedience, warning that questioning their authority was the same as questioning God. Yet as their words echoed through the chapel, they were met not with conviction, but with silence. The people listened, but their eyes were downcast, their bodies stiff with fear. For the first time, some men stayed away entirely, choosing to remain in their homes rather than sit beneath the council's gaze. Mothers whispered prayers not in unity but in isolation, clutching their children tightly as though protecting them from the very men who claimed to guard the valley's soul. The cracks widened when the storms continued. Fields flooded, livestock grew sick, and the once fertile land seemed to rebel against its keepers. Some saw it as divine punishment. Others whispered that it was no punishment from heaven at all, but from the spirits of the women the covenant had silenced. Rumors spread quickly now, carried in hushed voices over fences and across dimly lit kitchens. A few even dared to suggest that Cedar Valley was cursed, that God had abandoned them. Others, quietly and dangerously, began to wonder if the council itself was to blame. The council sensed the shift. Their sermons grew harsher, filled with threats of eternal damnation. They spoke of demons among them, of loyalty being tested. But the more they shouted, the less their words held weight. Fear had once united Cedar Valley. Now it was dividing it. In the shadows of the valley, a dangerous thought began to take root. What if leaving was not betrayal but salvation? It began quietly, with whispers passed in the dead of night. A small group of women, widows and wives who had seen too much, made a plan. They would take their children and flee Cedar Valley before the council's grip consumed them too. No one knew where they would go, only that anywhere was safer than here. Sarah's sister Lydia became their anchor. She had hidden food beneath loose floorboards, enough for a week's journey. Rebecca's cousin had a map, stolen long ago from a traveling merchant, showing a path through the mountains. At first, only 3 families agreed. By the night of the escape, nearly a dozen had joined them. Fear had spread too far to be contained. They chose a stormy night, believing thunder would mask their steps. Cloaked and trembling, they gathered near the western path, children clutched tightly in their arms. For a brief, fragile moment, hope flickered in their eyes. The hope of freedom. But Cedar Valley was not so easily escaped. The council had been watching, whether through spies or frightened neighbors who betrayed the plan. The truth was discovered. As the group reached the edge of the valley, lanterns flared in the darkness. Men emerged from the trees, rifles glinting in the storm's lightning. Screams erupted. Children cried as their mothers clung to them. The council shouted, their voices booming over the thunder. Some begged for mercy, others cursed the council outright. But all were dragged back through the mud, their belongings cast aside, their dreams of escape crushed beneath the weight of the covenant. The punishment was swift. At the next gathering, the council declared the families guilty of treachery. The women were marked as sinners, their names struck from prayer. Some were never seen again after that night. Their children were parceled into other households, raised under stricter watch. The message was clear. Cedar Valley was not a place one could leave. It was a cage, and the council held the only key. Yet in their cruelty, they had made a fatal mistake. For every scream, every tear shed that night only fueled the fire of rebellion in the hearts of those who remained. The failed escape shattered what little peace remained in Cedar Valley. The sight of mothers and children dragged through the mud lingered in every villager's memory, haunting them more than any sermon could. The covenant had shown its true face, not protectors, but jailers. Fear was still present, but it had changed. It was no longer the fear of questioning authority. It was the fear of what would happen if no one fought back. Whispers turned sharper now, spoken not only by women, but by men who had grown weary of guilt. Fathers who had once stood with the council now paced at night, tormented by the sound of Rachel's screams and the memory of their neighbor's punishment. The storms raged on, tearing through the valley. Crops rotted, the earth cracked, and livestock starved. Each disaster deepened the belief that God's blessing had abandoned them. Some began to mutter openly that the council was cursed, that the valley itself was doomed as long as its secrets remained buried. Inside homes, families clung to one another. Mothers prayed not for salvation but for survival. Children asked questions no one could answer, and every night the silence between husbands and wives grew heavier. The breaking point came when another woman, quiet, obedient Margaret Hill, vanished without warning. Unlike the others, she had never questioned, never resisted. Her disappearance proved what many had already begun to fear. Obedience offered no protection. The valley was no longer divided by loyalty or defiance, it was united by dread. The covenant had taken too much, and now even those who once believed were beginning to turn. Cedar Valley was a tinderbox, and all it needed was a spark. The spark came at dawn. It was Margaret Hill's brother, Thomas, who finally broke the silence. A quiet man, loyal to the covenant for years, he could no longer stomach the lies. Standing in the chapel, he shouted what others had only whispered, "You are not men of God, you are murderers." Gasps filled the room. The council rose in fury, but before they could act, others joined him. One by one, voices rang out, women, men, even children. The walls of silence crumbled, replaced by a roar of defiance. Chaos erupted. Lanterns were overturned, pews shoved aside. Men who had once sworn loyalty to the covenant turned against the council, fists flying, voices thundering with years of suppressed rage. Mothers dragged their children outside, shielding them from the violence as the chapel shook with screams. The council tried to restore order, but their authority had evaporated. For the first time, the people saw them not as holy men, but as frail, frightened tyrants. When one councilman raised his rifle, the crowd surged. The weapon was torn from his hands. His cries were drowned in the storm of fists and fury. By midday, Cedar Valley was burning. The chapel's steeple collapsed, smoke curling into the grey sky. The covenant, once untouchable, lay shattered at the feet of those it had ruled. But victory came at a price. Blood stained the ground, and the valley echoed with the cries of both the fallen and the free. Families huddled together in the wreckage, uncertain of what they had unleashed. For the first time in decades, Cedar Valley belonged to its people, not its council. Yet freedom felt less like salvation and more like the beginning of something darker. When the smoke cleared, Cedar Valley was unrecognizable. The chapel stood in ruins, its charred beams jutting into the sky like broken bones. Houses were ransacked, fields trampled, and the once orderly streets now lay scattered with debris. The covenant was gone, but so was the certainty that had bound the valley together for generations. The people wandered through the wreckage in silence. Mothers searched for missing children. Men buried the bodies of neighbors and former leaders alike. There was no victory song, no celebration, only exhaustion, grief, and the uneasy weight of freedom. For the first time in years, there was no council to dictate who lived, who vanished, who prayed. But with that freedom came questions no one was ready to answer. Who would lead them now? Where would they go? Could Cedar Valley survive without the rules that had defined it, even in cruelty? Some spoke of leaving, of scattering into the mountains to find new lives far from the cursed land. Others insisted on staying, determined to rebuild from the ashes, but all agreed on one thing: the covenant's shadow would never be forgotten. At night, when the valley grew quiet again, the people swore they could still hear Rachel Hemming's screams carried on the wind, mingling with the whispers of every woman who had vanished before her. Their voices were a reminder of what had been lost and of the price paid to break free. Cedar Valley was no longer a prison, but it was not yet a sanctuary. It was something in between, a scar on the land, a wound that would never fully heal. And in the silence of that scar, the people waited, uncertain if freedom was salvation or the beginning of another curse.